Good morning. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5698 for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5698, to amend Title 18 United States Code to punish criminal offenses targeting law enforcement officers and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Today we are considering the Protect and Serve Act, a bill that will allow federal prosecution of those who seek to harm our nation's law enforcement officers. The number of ambush-style killings of law enforcement officers has increased significantly in recent years. In 2016, according to data from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, such killings had risen by 250% from the year before and were at their highest level in 10 years. Only last month, 2 sheriff's deputies were senselessly murdered while they sat and ate lunch in Gainesville, Florida. Last week, a Chicago gang leader shot an ATF agent as the agent attempted to place a tracker on his car. These ambush shootings are particularly abhorrent acts. Our courageous men and women in law enforcement place their lives on the line each day to protect and serve. They now must worry about being targets due to their already stressful profession. Furthermore, these attacks are a threat to public order and a challenge to the authority of the state. They fundamentally undermine a functional society. The bill will help deter these vicious attacks by permitting federal prosecution of anyone who knowingly causes serious bodily injury to a law enforcement officer, where the crime either affects interstate commerce or where the victim is a federal law enforcement officer. This bill adheres to principles of federalism by requiring that in order to bring a federal case under this statute, the Attorney General must certify that either the state does not have jurisdiction, the state has requested the federal government assume jurisdiction, the results in a state prosecution left the federal interest in public safety unvindicated, or a federal prosecution is otherwise necessary to secure substantial justice. I want to thank my distinguished colleagues, Sheriff Rutherford and Chief Demings, for introducing this bill. I also want to thank and recognize the brave men and women of law enforcement and their advocates, many of whom are with us in the hearing room today. Without objection, letters of support for H.R. 5698 from the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Association of Police Organizations, the National Sheriff's Association, and the Sergeants Benevolent Association will be included in the record. Put simply, police officers are the thin blue line between a functional society and anarchy. We must ensure that when these officers are targeted based upon the uniform they wear and the job they do, the punishment is sufficient to deter any further attacks. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And it's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Protect and Serve Act, while rooted in laudable goals, will not strengthen protections for law enforcement officers, and it fails to make meaningful reforms that would improve police-community relations. Although I will not oppose the bill, I believe that its consideration today reflects a wasted opportunity. This legislation would create a new offense under Title 18 of the U.S. Code for the crime of targeting law enforcement officers. Current law, however, at both the federal and state level, already makes this a crime. It is not clear why this bill is needed at all. No member of this committee questions the difficulty, danger, and stress associated with being a police officer. A white paper commissioned by the Ruderman Family Foundation reported that last year, 129 police officers died in the line of duty, 46 from shootings, with an additional 140 reported officer suicides. And since the start of 2018, at least 36 law enforcement officers across the United States have died while on duty, with 24 of the deaths caused by gunfire. Our hearts go out to the families of those officers who have lost their lives in the line of duty. As a result of the risk inherent to policing, there is no profession more widely protected under federal and state law than working in law enforcement. All 50 states have laws that enhance penalties for crimes against peace officers, and in some instances, crimes against the broadly defined category of first responders. In fact, Section 2 of the bill clearly acknowledges that states have primary jurisdiction for attacks on state and local police officers, which presents an open question for the sponsors of this bill as to whether the Department of Justice would ever exercise jurisdiction if this legislation were enacted. I would note that my own state of New York has 4 separate criminal statutes addressing attacks on law enforcement officers. Moreover, federal laws already impose a life sentence or even the death penalty on persons convicted of killing state and local law enforcement officers or other employees assisting with federal investigations. Simply put, the legislation under consideration today does not improve upon this existing legal framework. But I want to be clear about the respect that we have for the difficult work undertaken by our law enforcement professionals. While attacks on law enforcement officials are completely unacceptable, the existing legal framework for prosecuting those crimes is more than adequate at both the state and federal levels. If it were not, I would be an ardent supporter of this legislation. In addition, we should consider the adverse consequences of taking such a one-sided approach to the issue of police practices. Rather than advancing a bill that amounts to an empty gesture on the eve of Police Week, the committee should instead be focusing on real reform measures that will actually protect law enforcement officers, first responders, and their communities. Over the years, well-documented unconstitutional policing practices in communities of color across the United States have eroded trust between these communities and the law enforcement officials sworn to protect them. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department currently has 19 consent decrees with troubled police departments nationwide. Dating back to the mid-1990s, every region of the country has suffered some kind of high-profile incident. Last year alone, in 2017, almost 1,000 people were killed by police, according to the Washington Post. Another media outlet estimates that there were more than 1,100 police-related fatalities last year, with people of color representing more than 50% of those unarmed during fatal encounters with police. Yet, in the 2 years since the creation of the Bipartisan Policing Strategies Working Group, this committee has advanced no police reform legislation. Instead, we are asked today to consider H.R. 5698, a one-sided approach that presents the strong risk of creating a perception of bias against community-based policing concerns. The committee's interests would be better served by working to foster law enforcement reforms aimed at helping local jurisdictions meet their constitutional obligation of fair and unbiased policing. I hope that soon we will bring the committee's balanced work on law enforcement accountability out into the open, with hearings and the introduction of legislation. We should care equally about harms by and against police officers and their impact on local communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I would like to recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Rutherford of Florida, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for bringing up this important bill to stop these violent attacks on our law enforcement officers. As a career law enforcement officer and sheriff of Jacksonville for 12 years, I know what our officers go through every day when they put on their uniform, say goodbye to their families, and head out to do the important work of protecting our communities. We have seen an uptick recently in violence against police officers, especially ambush-style attacks like we just saw in Florida last month when 2 deputies were shot while having lunch. And I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, this was preceded within the last couple years by an event that I was horrified to see, which was a group of individuals marching down the streets of New York City, chanting openly, "What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want them? Now." I never thought I would see such an act in America. And then just a few months after that, Mr. Chairman, the Dallas Police Department is protecting that exact same group as they're marching in Dallas, Texas. And 5 Dallas, Texas police officers are ambushed and murdered. Just this year alone, 87 officers have been shot in the line of duty, of which 28 ultimately lost their lives. That's a 75% higher than last year at this time, and it's nothing short of a tragedy. We need a serious response through these enhanced penalties to deter these horrendous acts upon our police officers. And this is why I'm proud to have introduced the Serve and Protect Act of 2018 with my colleague from Florida and former law enforcement officer, Congresswoman Val Demings, who served the people of Orlando for almost 3 decades, Mr. Chairman, including as the chief of the Orlando Police Department. To stop these attacks, our bill ensures that those who want to do harm will face the strongest penalties. It creates a federal penalty for individuals who deliberately target not only federal officers, but in some cases, state and local officers as well. And Congresswoman Demings and I have worked closely with the FOP on this bill, and we have earned the support of the National Association of Police Organizations, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, and the Major County Sheriffs of America as well. Targeting police officers and ambushing them while they sit in their cars and eat lunch cannot be tolerated. We must hold accountable those who seek to target and attack those who dedicate their lives to keeping us safe. This dangerous trend in violent acts against our police must end. We as a committee have the opportunity to help protect officers who put their lives on the line day in and day out to protect us. And I ask my colleagues here today to support this bill and to support law enforcement across America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigations, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all applaud the co-sponsors of this legislation, Mr. Rutherford and certainly Ms. Demings, Mr. Rutherford, Sheriff in the Sheriff Department, if I recall, and Ms. Demings in the Police Department, if I recall, as Chief, among many other titles that you've had. Let me intrude to the extent that I have worked extensively with police officers dealing with my role as a municipal court judge and assisting on late-night warrants and probable cause warrants, and recognize the dangers that our officers face. I think it is important to take note of the fact that we are discussing a bill that, first of all, has as its premise many federal and state criminal laws already in place that should be enforced dealing with the protection of officers. These laws have strong penalties, and they also have been enhanced. Also, I think it is important to note that we want to protect against widespread attacks on police officers, and in doing that, we want to have legislation that might be a pathway for bringing community and law enforcement together. Whether this bill does that enough leads me to believe that we have more work to be done. So as we come upon Police Week and the tragedies of those who have fallen in battle, I would offer to my colleagues and look forward to working with them on the question of tools that we give the police department, and that to the co-sponsors, hope that we can engage as the ranking member of the Criminal Justice Committee is to talk about the Law Enforcement Integrity Act, which does several things. I think people misread it. It provides money. It provides money to the 18,000 police departments across America, and it gives them a structure of accreditation and resources to train their officers, both in concepts of escalation or de-escalation, and as well to be able to give them dollars to help them become accredited. What that means is gives them resource. You haven't made the grade, then here's what you need to have to make the grade. I think if we focus on training aspects, de-escalation, work in, I call it professional development, but work in the societal needs that police officers have, and then one of the points that was near and dear to me is a medal. A provision for a medal for the service of officers is included in that legislation. So I'd make the argument that the Protect and Serve Act certainly has a purpose that is valuable. I would also ask my state and local municipalities to ensure that they enforce the laws that protect our police and our community. And I'd ask my colleagues to join me and Mr. Nadler and others and Mr. Goodlap, who knows of this legislation, to move that legislation forward that deals with the various points of concern that I think police officers, the national sheriffs, the national organization of police chiefs have been over the years very supportive. So with that, let me ask Mr. Chairman to submit into the record a letter from another number of organizations, from ACLU to LDF to NASW, Policy Link. I'm not reading them all. Ask unanimous consent to submit this into the record. Mr. Chairman, ask unanimous consent to submit a letter into the record.
Without objection, it will be made.
And to say that with the conclusion of my remarks, let me extend my hand of friendship and collaboration as we move forward and build on the tools that our law enforcement officers need, the community needs, and the infrastructure of civil liberties will be founded within that for both law enforcement and community. Thank you so very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Are there any amendments to H.R. 5698?
Chairman,
Oh,
move to
what
strike
purpose the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Nadler, and also our Ranking Member of our subcommittee. I'm speaking in strong support as a co-sponsor of H.R. 5698, Protect and Serve. As you know, I spent 27 years in law enforcement and had the honor of serving as the Chief of Police. And while I love my prior profession and adore the men and women in blue who do a very tough job, I am keenly aware that we have seen several troubling incidents involving the use of force by some officers around the country. We know the overwhelming majority of police officers perform their duties admirably under the toughest of circumstances, but all do not, and we have a duty to hold them accountable. While I am new to this committee, I was pleased to learn of the Community Policing Strategies Working Group, but extremely disappointed that the committee chose to do absolutely nothing to address hiring guidelines, community policing strategies, training, and use of force standards. Bringing uniformity to these areas, I believe, protects our officers and our citizens. I do support this legislation because I am concerned of the number of ambush-style shootings that we have seen this year. You've already heard that we've seen a 75% increase in officers killed by firearms. I am particularly concerned about these shootings. As you already heard, last month, 2 deputies were assassinated while they ate lunch. And how could we forget former Dallas Police Chief David Brown, who said this: when his 5 officers were ambushed and murdered, he said, and I quote, "Are we asking cops to do too much in this country? Every time society fails, we put it off on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding? Let the cops handle it. Got a loose dog problem? Let the cops chase it down. Schools fail? Let's give it to the cops. That's too much to ask. Policing was never meant to solve all of our problems," unquote. We are, Mr. Chairman, law enforcement, just the thin blue line. A handful of folks willing to do a very tough job. Without them, there would be continued lawlessness on our streets, and we are a nation of laws. We must continue to send a strong message that America has zero tolerance for the brutal murder of a police officer. While I support H.R. 5698, I am hopeful that this committee will allow the Community Policing Strategies Group to do its work, and we look forward to continuing to work with our subcommittee. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlewoman. For what purpose the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Thank you, sir, to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with the remarks of our ranking member and of Ms. Demings. I support this bill, and I support it strongly, and I appreciate what law enforcement does. They're certainly an essential part of an ordered liberty and of a free and safe society. But at the same time, there needs to be a look at situations to where a large percentage of our population feels that there is not an even-handedness in justice when it comes to law enforcement using deadly force in an improper and illegal fashion. And we've seen so many instances of that in the last few years where it's been videoed, and it's people of color have been shot and killed when it was not appropriate, when they had not committed an offense that threatened the security of the officer or anybody else in the community. There is a bill, Mr. Chairman, that we have, which is the Independent Review Act, that I filed with Mr. Lacey Clay. It has training for law enforcement officers on the differences in our communities, sensitivity training, and also has an independent prosecutor portion of the bill to see that there's no appearance of unfair playing field when an officer is involved in deadly force, that the DA would be from another jurisdiction, and see to it that there was a fairness in everybody's minds. It has 99 co-sponsors. It's been endorsed by the Chicago Tribune, a Republican newspaper, and the NAACP, among others. And Mr. Chairman, I would just ask you to take a look at the bill and schedule it for a hearing. It has been through 2 Congresses. It has not had a hearing, and it certainly doesn't make people who have, some of the people I suspect, Congressman Rutherford, who marched and said the things they said, which I find despicable. There was a reason, though, why they did that. And some of the reasons, because they don't believe justice is fair and equal and blind. And the Independent Review Act would help at least make them understand that there was an independent person determining if there was probable cause that a crime had been committed. So at least we should have a hearing, and I'd ask the chair to look into it.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I will definitely take a look at the bill, and I'll get back to you about whether there are possible further steps forward based on our...
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it very much.
First, the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition.
I would move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me just clear part of the record, and I don't think it was intentional, but I want to make sure for our purpose it's correct. The people marching down Fifth Avenue chanting death to cops is a very accurate description, but if you want to be very accurate, it was a few dozen out of 25,000 people out there protesting the Eric Garner incident, and that was in 2014. The Dallas ambush of the police officers was in July of 2016, and those two were not connected. It was not the same groups. Any ambush of police officers, any injury to police officers who protect and serve our community is despicable, and I want justice for those families. But I think it's one thing that we don't talk about in Congress. I'm on Homeland Security and Judiciary, the 2 committees with the jurisdiction. We have never had a hearing on sovereign citizens that has killed more police officers than any other group, any other person since we've been here. The Baton Rouge ambush that killed those officers was sovereign citizen. The St. John Parish ambush in Louisiana that killed 2 officers was sovereign citizen. But we will not look at domestic terrorism and sovereign citizens. But nevertheless, the other part is, this is one of those bills that people say, well, how could you ever vote against it? I love police officers. I named a post office after one of my friends who was killed by a suspect that he was transporting to jail. But here's where it's hard for me. In New Orleans, after Katrina, on the Danziger Bridge, you had an unarmed, mentally ill man and a teenager gunned down by police officers 4 other people were injured. Those officers were convicted. Later, the appeals court overturned their convictions, and then they pleaded guilty. After extensive cover-up by the New Orleans Police Department, they pled guilty to those actions. And you know what they received? From 3 years to 12 years in jail for gunning down unarmed people. Now, this bill says if you attempt to murder a police officer and cause great bodily harm, which could be vague, you could be trying, I've seen instances where trying to escape, you crash into their car, they break a leg, then there's a question about what is serious bodily harm. But in the climate that we're in this country, I think that if we're not holding police to a very strict standard, then what we're doing here today only exacerbates the mistrust or distrust and disconnect between law enforcement and the communities they represent. So I'm trying to reconcile in my mind how officers who gunned down mentally ill, unarmed people on a bridge, spent years covering it up. The federal FBI came in and uncovered it all. They got between 3 and 12 years. And in this bill, we say that anyone that injures a police officer in an attempt to kill them would do life. And the question becomes, where's the equity? Where's the fairness? Where's the justice? And I'm just concerned about where we are. And I would applaud the working group on community policing that I'm a part of, but we've not moved forward with anything on that. So if I'm one of these young people who wake up, go to school, and are concerned about what's happening in my community, I think we're sending them a message right now that we moved on one issue without moving on the other one. And I'll sit and reflect, and I would hope that my friends in law enforcement, and especially my family that are law enforcement officers, understand that if I vote against this bill, it's not because I don't value what they do, because I do. But I think we may be taking a step in the wrong direction by picking sides, and I'm not asserting motives to anyone. I think we're all judged by our life experiences, but my life experience is Danziger Bridge, the Henry Glover shooting, and some others in New Orleans, and I just don't know where I can go on this. But with that, I would thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
And the gentleman's time has expired. I'm happy to yield the gentleman an additional minute if he would yield back to me.
Yes.
I take the gentleman's concerns to heart, and very seriously. It is a legitimate point that there is disparity in the sentencing of people for various types of crimes. Obviously, we want to send a strong message that police officers whose sworn duty is to keep us all safe, we need to have a very strong message to keep them safe in doing their duty. But existing law, federal law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deals with deprivation of constitutional rights, including the use of excessive force and so on, with regard to individuals by state and local police officers, and that law, existing law, includes the death penalty for a police officer if that use of excessive force results in the death of an individual. So I think there's an issue here the gentleman has identified. I have a feeling it has more to do with the enforcement of the law than with the laws on the books that are available to be used as tools to right the wrong that the gentleman identified, where police officers very wrongly took the life of somebody, and perhaps those sentences should have been considerably higher. I think federal law today allows for much higher sentences, and as I say, including the death penalty, if it results in the death of an individual. So I'm happy to have further dialogue with the gentleman about that.
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, but what I would just encourage is that if we look at 18 U.S.C. 242, there's a very strict, almost a premeditation aspect to it, where the intent has to be to deprive them of their civil rights. It's a bar that's very hard to meet, and I'm not even casting judgment on my U.S. attorney who struck the deal, because the bar for him to convict is so high. And the other part I would just ask is that we have to be cognizant of just where we are and where we find ourselves in this country. It is much more likely that a jury is going to give the benefit of the doubt to a police officer sworn to uphold the law that it was not intentional. And most states already have, and in Louisiana we do, for killing a police officer, you can get the death penalty. You certainly will get life and all of those. So we're just piggybacking on and making sure that there's a federal way to do it. But the bigger concern, and I really hate to say this, and I just hope people don't think I'm gratuitously attacking the Justice Department. However, if you're a young person and your question is, now you give the Attorney General's office the ability to come in and take over any incident involving a police officer in charge federally, and the question becomes, do they have more trust in their local DA that they will look at the facts or circumstances, or do they have more trust in the U.S. Attorney General, who would probably have no connection to their community because he only comes from one community by virtue of just reality? So I just don't know, and I'm not assigning any ill motives to anyone who's pushing this bill. What I am worried about, though, is just causing a bigger disconnect, and the standard on 18 U.S.C. is so high that very few officers are ever convicted through that. In fact, most of them are found not guilty. With that, I'll yield back.
If the gentleman would continue to yield, let me say I'm happy to have further discussion with you. We can review 242 together. If there's some legislative remedy there, or if there's some communication we can make to the Department of Justice that we think this is a problem that they need to take into account as they take action. Either way, as I said to Mr. Cohen with regard to his legislation, we'll take a close look at that, and I say that sincerely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Gentleman yield. I don't know who has the
Gentlewoman
time.
from Texas seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, let me indicate that there are a number of legislative initiatives. Let me thank Mr. Richmond for raising what many of us face in our community, where we have the greatest admiration. Our dear friends are police officers. Every time I see them, I tell them, stay safe now. There's a great affinity and kinship. But I think it's important. I think this is a great discussion, and I'm glad this bill has generated it. We obviously can't solve all problems in this discussion. But I think, Mr. Chairman, as you know, we have a police working group on a number of issues. And of course, we have the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Bill that has been, that we are now engaged in negotiations on. And I think one of the greatest elements of that is the funding and the de-escalation and the training, and also the sensitivity on, if you will, not only professional development, but the societal stresses that police officers go through. So if we are making a point about our life experiences, but really our current experiences, the police community issue is crucial. It will be a credit to this committee if we could pass legislation that has a combination of the advocacy groups, the mothers whose children have died through gun violence in many different ways, and of course law enforcement who go out and investigate. No matter who has perpetrated the shooting of the individual, they're the ones that are investigating. So if we recognize that we have these elements in society and that we have the power through legislative initiatives to work on these elements with both a peace offering and stern requirements and support, Mr. Chairman, I would urge you to have us look at these issues sooner rather than later, and I think we could find common ground. When I went to our national associations of police chiefs and sheriffs and spoke to them over the last 2 years, they were welcoming of legislation that would enhance their working tools, their training, their accreditation, the focus on de-escalation, and a number of issues that they confront while they're out protecting and serving. So I would just ask, Mr. Chairman, for that to be part of our wheelhouse and our discussion going forward, and to include our members who have experience being on the streets of this nation and understand that aspect, as we who have different experiences being on the bench, handing out probable cause warrants to our officers, hearing them tell their cases, knowing the stress and the challenges that they face, and many others who have different experiences. We need to get on this issue as quickly as possible.
For the purpose, the gentleman
I yield
from Rhode
back.
Island seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too, of course, support this legislation, but really do want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Louisiana and the gentlelady from Florida and the gentlelady from Texas. I hope that as we continue to think about ways to enhance both police officers' safety and the safety of the communities we represent, that we recognize that the fundamental challenge is to build trusting relationships between the police and the community. When I was mayor of the city of Providence, we instituted a community policing model that really built upon this idea of strengthening the relationships between members of the community and the police departments working in their neighborhoods. And it produced the lowest crime rate the city of Providence had in 40 years. My police chief used to always say the single most powerful weapon we have in our department is not a gun, is not any other equipment, it's the trust of the community. And so I think there are a lot of very successful models that really focus on training and professional development and partnerships with nonprofit organizations and de-escalation training and a number of things that can really enhance the relationship between the police and the community that ultimately produce better results for community members, a safer community, and greater safety for our brave men and women in law enforcement. And, you know, there are a couple of examples. We had it in the city of Providence where we developed these relationships between the police and mental health organizations to respond with the police in the police car to a domestic violence scene, so that immediately the family members would get access to professional mental health counseling on the scene, working in partnership. The mental health professional would ride in the police car, working in another program with police officers working with former gang members who are out in the community helping to mediate conflicts, to prevent violence from happening, and the trust that developed between the police and the community as a result of this. So I hope as we move forward that we don't just address the kind of the failure, which is this violence that happens against police, and that's reflected in this bill, but work in a proactive way to prevent violence against police officers by strengthening police-community relations and the trust that's absolutely essential to successful policing and to protecting our brave men and women in law enforcement. I look forward to working with the members of the working group to advance that, and again, thank the chairman for the recognition and yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. For purposes, the gentleman has already been recognized on the bill, so would the gentlewoman from Georgia seek time and yield to the gentleman?
Yes, I yield my time to my
Gentlewoman
colleague
is
from
recognized for
Florida.
5 minutes, and she yields to the gentleman.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. I would like to really comment on something that my colleague Ms. Lee mentioned earlier, and that was the accreditation process. And I can tell you, having come from an organization that had the triple crown of law enforcement accreditation, I'm a very big believer in the accreditation process, and holding officers and agencies accountable to a certain standard, so that communities know that their law enforcement agency and their officers are being held to the highest standards throughout the country. And I would like to just make a public commitment here to Mr. Cohen and Mrs. Lee and everyone across the aisle that I really look forward to working with you on the Police Integrity Act and the Independent Review Act. And looking at those things, I'm very interested in, I'm always looking for ways to enhance police-community relations, understanding that we have to have that partnership within our communities. And I can tell you it was very successful in Jacksonville. We too, as the colleague mentioned, that they had the lowest crime they'd had in 40 years. We had the lowest crime we'd had in 41 years in Jacksonville in 2011 as a result of initiatives that brought all of the community, even our most challenged parts of the community, together to work with law enforcement. And so I look forward to partnering with those across the aisle who are involved in this already, and I look forward to getting involved in that. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back to my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to H.R. 5698? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 5698 favorably to the House. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5682 for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5682, to provide for programs to help reduce the risk that prisoners will recidivate upon release from prison and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any time, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Today we consider H.R. 5682, or the First Step Act, introduced by Congressman Doug Collins and Hakeem Jeffries. Over 2 years ago, we launched our committee's Criminal Justice Reform Initiative. In doing so, we declared that the committee's initiative will pursue responsible, common-sense criminal justice reforms to make sure our federal laws and regulations punish wrongdoers, protect individual freedom, work as efficiently and fairly as possible, do not duplicate state efforts, and do not waste taxpayer dollars. The First Step Act that we are considering today is a direct result of that initiative and adheres to the objectives we set forth then. H.R. 5682 places a new focus on rehabilitation. While we recognize criminal behavior needs to be punished and criminals need to be incarcerated, we must also acknowledge that our prison population needs to be rehabilitated to the greatest extent practicable. The bill establishes a risk and needs assessment as the basis of an effective recidivism reduction program and an efficient and effective federal prison system. The First Step Act will incentivize prisoners to participate in evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, produce activities and jobs that will actually reduce their risk of recidivism. This bill is vitally important for a number of reasons. First, the growing prison budget is consuming an ever-increasing percentage of the Department of Justice's budget. These rising costs are becoming a real and immediate threat to public safety. The more dollars we put into unnecessary prison costs, the fewer dollars we can invest in criminal and national security investigations and prosecutions. Imagine our communities with fewer U.S. Marshals, ATF, FBI, and DEA agents to investigate and prevent crime, and imagine our communities with fewer U.S. attorneys to prosecute crimes. Second, we know that without programming and intervention, prisoners are more likely to recidivate. We cannot allow the cycle of crime to continue. By using a focused approach for each prisoner, we can lower the risk of recidivism. Fewer recidivists mean fewer prisoners in the future, greater savings to the American taxpayer, and safer communities. This bill is important because when prisoners who have received intervention are released, they are less likely to commit crimes. When that happens, our streets and communities are safer, and former prisoners are likely to leave the life of crime behind and become productive members of society and contribute to their communities. And I want to add that I think that when we help people in prison get ready for the rest of their life, they are going to enjoy greater freedoms and use those freedoms more responsibly for the betterment of themselves and for our society. So I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for introducing this innovative and much-needed piece of legislation. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Chairman, before I have my opening statement, I have a motion at the desk, I suppose? Put a motion. I have a motion I move that consideration of H.R. 5682 be postponed until June 6th, 2018.
Mr. Chairman,
What purpose the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
move to table Mr. Nadler's motion.
The statement and then move to table.
The gentleman will suspend. Mr. Nadler is recognized to speak on the reason for his.
Reserving my motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to postpone consideration of the legislation before us for 1 month so that the committee will have sufficient time to negotiate and mark up sentencing reform legislation. Sentencing reform is the keystone of criminal justice reform. When this committee began the effort to examine the problem of overcriminalization and mass incarceration 6 years ago, members on both sides of the aisle quickly recognized that the root of the problem was excessive sentencing in general and mandatory minimums in particular. Last Congress, members approved sentencing reform legislation as part of a package of criminal justice reforms. Unfortunately, this Congress, our sentencing reform efforts have lagged as the majority has delayed engaging in substantive negotiations on sentencing reform with Democratic members. By postponing the markup for 1 month, members will have the time to develop a significant and bipartisan proposal on sentencing reform that can be paired with prison reform legislation. As more than 70 organizations, including the Leadership Conference, NAACP, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, AFL-CIO, Center for American Progress, and the Sentencing Project wrote to us yesterday that it is imperative that we pursue both measures. Mr. Chairman, we have waited nearly a year and a half into this Congress to reach the point where we are discussing criminal justice reform. I don't think it is asking too much that we spend a few additional weeks to try to do the right thing and find a consensus on both sentencing and prison reform.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I would renew my motion to table. I think just to discuss the motion for just 1 second is this has been discussed. There is a lot of discussion that's been going on. My partner in this, Hakeem Jeffries, Cedric Richmond, many others have been discussing this. And there is a certain point in time when you actually look to help people and move things that actually help. There's also other times that we can to continue to discuss politics. At this point in time, I believe this bill has reached its peak. It is time to move. And going along with the administration, the White House, Department of Justice, working with our partners in the Senate, and working with partners in the House, this is our time to move. I agree with the gentleman. I would like to see sentencing reform removed, but also I'm also looking at this from a practical purpose of looking at families right now and saying, let's help them now. With that, I move to table.
The question is on the motion to table. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is not agreed to. The gentleman from New York is recognized on the underlying bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, with respect to today's consideration of H.R. 5682, the First Step Act, I appreciate your efforts to work on one aspect of criminal justice reform, which is the need to do a better job of preparing federal prisoners to return to their communities less likely to reoffend. I want to say at the outset that I am disappointed that we have not yet committed to adopting the main priority of committee Democrats with respect to criminal justice reform. That priority, as mentioned a moment ago, is the enactment of legislation to reform federal sentencing, particularly mandatory minimums, so that we significantly reduce mass incarceration. The federal prison population has massively increased in recent decades from just over 30,000 in 1982 to over 180,000 today. This explosion has contributed to our national crisis of mass incarceration, with over 2 million people incarcerated in our prisons and jails. Much of this increase has been due to a misguided and counterproductive strategy to deal with drug abuse and addiction, and to sentencing policies that are too often unjust. As the Legislative Committee of the Federal Public and Community Defenders noted in the letter they sent to the committee recently, quote, "The success of prison reform legislation is uncertain at best. The need for and benefits of sentencing reform are well established by 3 decades of experience and data. The most significant driver of the 5-fold increase in the federal prison population over those 30 years has been mandatory minimums, particularly those for drug offenses. The extreme levels of incarceration come at a human and financial cost that is unjustified by the legitimate purposes of sentencing and that perversely undermines public safety," close quote. That is why sentencing reform should be our first priority. I do not doubt that H.R. 5682 is clearly well-intentioned and considered. However, at the same time, I would hope that we will continue to explore ways to improve the bill and encourage as many prisoners as possible to engage in recidivism, reduction programming, seeking additional input from experts and practitioners. I know that we all want to pursue prison reform that is evidence-based and is as effective as possible. I also want to note my full support for several additional provisions in the bill, such as fixing the currently flawed manner by which good time credits are calculated, prohibiting the shackling of pregnant women in federal prisons, and expanding compassionate release for elderly prisoners. I do want to recognize the hard work of Crime Subcommittee Ranking Member Sheila Jackson-Lee, Hakeem Jeffries, who has been a strong leader in this effort, Doug Collins, the sponsor of the bill, Karen Bass, Cedric Richmond, and others, including the chairman, who attempted to develop a consensus bill. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on the critical criminal justice reform issues that we must address. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I'd now like to recognize the sponsor of the legislation, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Looking forward to this day has been, again, another consuming effort, and I think the ranking member just rightly named many across the aisle that have come together to work. Again, with my co-sponsor on this, lead co-sponsor Hakeem Jeffries, with Cedric Richmond, Ms. Bass, just Sheila Jackson-Lee. On our side, Chairman, you and the subcommittee and the committee staff have been outstanding in moving something forward. And I think this is the thing when we look at a lot of groups and we do things in D.C. This has come down to another time at the end of the day when it's very easy to look at bills and we think about it in pieces of paper. But behind these pieces of paper are faces. They're the faces of people who need a chance at redemption, a chance to make right what maybe once was a mistake and now they realize that they need that help to make it right. Evidence-based works. Evidence-based approach to this works. We see it in our states. We see it all over the country. And this is what this bill offers. This is the step that we need. First Steps is a great title for this. It is something that we look forward to. And yes, we can argue about how far we want to go. We can argue and talk about how I would like to make it perfect. I wish that we actually pass perfect legislation up here all the time, but I don't think there has ever been one, and holding a no vote on this bill because it is not perfect is wrong. In fact, why would you vote no on a bill that would unshackle women who are having babies in prison? Why would you vote no on early release for elderly prisoners? Why would you vote no on helping people come into prison with an assessment, an evidence-based assessment that says, how can we keep you from recidivizing and going back into community and being a part? That's the good part of this bill. That is the part that at the end of the day, as I've said many times, is an M&M's, pure and simple. It's money and morals. As the chairman said, it's about the money principle of what we're spending our time on and how we're properly spending it. But for me, it's also about the moral principle that I have yet to meet someone who has not made a mistake in life, who doesn't need a second chance. I was given that chance in my life through my own faith, and I believe it should be given to others. Now, make no mistake, there are some people who need to be in jail. There are those people who've just decided to live outside the bonds of life, and we need to find places for them. But then there's also some others that frankly, we're mad at. They need to pay for their crime, but also at the same time, we need to make sure that when they come out, they're ready to resume a life of production with their families and their friends. If you look at this bill any other way, just let me tell you how to look at it. You look at it with a face behind it. There are sons and daughters, moms and dads, aunts and uncles, even grandmoms and granddads that can be affected by this bill. This is a good piece of bipartisan legislation that the White House has worked on, Jared Kushner, so many others that I've named earlier in the groups. In fact, Mr. Chairman, as I finish up, I could go on about the discussions that have went by. I can tell you about Hakeem Jeffries and I go into groups in which each and I probably would never be invited to individually, but together we have a firm face going forward and have partners on each side. And Hakeem, thank you again for this partnership. But I also want to enter into the record, and it might take me just a moment, but I want to make sure these are entered into the record as we go forward. In support of this, BME, National Fellowship, Can Do Foundation, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Hands of Hope Outreach Ministry, Incorporated, the Loam, National Incarceration Association, Operation Restoration, Project Liberation, the Promise Justice Initiative, the Real Cost of Prisons Project, Restore Her, Big Pictures, Root and Rebound, Last Mile, Women's Involved in Reentry Efforts, Women Who Never Give Up, the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, new Operation Hope, Faith and Freedom Coalition, Just Detention, and also others that we have found is going along. FAM, Freedom Works, Heritage, Koch Industries, many others who have all said this is a positive step forward. So again, as I stop today.
Without objection,
Thank you, Mr.
you
Chairman.
made it part of the record.
So without any further moving this forward, I just encourage the committee and I encourage the folks today who may be watching this to say that there is faces behind bills. And this one, probably more than any, is about being firm, being decisive, having a punishment that fits, but also having a heart that says our job also is to be prudent in our money and always be open with a heart that is moral. With that, that is why we move this bill forward. Would we like to see everything? Sure. At one point, we all will move forward and work on the things that we can together. It's now time to move something forward, and today is the day. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and is pleased to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, the lead Democratic sponsor of the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me first just begin by thanking you and Congressman Collins, as well as Cedric Richmond and Val Demings and Karen Bass, and so many others who have worked hard in support of this legislation. In particular, I'm thankful to the partnership with Congressman Collins, who is authentically committed to reforming our criminal justice system in an era where the American people have been unjustly over-criminalized. And even those who are appropriately in confinement should be given the opportunity at a second chance in life to re-enter society and pursue the American dream. That is what the First Step Act is all about. We know that the mass incarceration epidemic in America began in 1971 when the then president declared drug abuse public enemy #1. At the time, there were less than 350,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, there are more than 2.1 million. It's a scandal that has ruined lives, ruined communities, and hurt the ability of the American economy to be as productive as it otherwise could be. Dramatic change is necessary on both the sentencing reform side and on the prison reform side. But this is a moment where we can take a first step toward meaningful change. The mass incarceration epidemic in America has been almost 50 years in the making. And you can't simply wave one legislative magic wand and make it all go away. It's going to require sustained effort, sustained intensity, sustained commitment, and a meaningful first step. And that is why this bill is so important, particularly because it's being done in a bipartisan way. And at the end of the day, if we're going to address the consequences of mass incarceration and those who have been put into a tough spot as a result of it, what better place to start than those who are immediately dealing with confinement by creating the type of transformative programming in education, in counseling, in vocational services that will allow them to be job ready upon release, and that has been proven based on evidence and research to significantly reduce the risk of recidivism in a way that will benefit them, in a way that will benefit their families, their communities, and the American taxpayer. There are a variety of important provisions that are in this bill: the good time credit fix, the fact that we are prioritizing for this programming individuals who are medium or high risk so that they get the opportunity to participate in programming that can be transformative for them, and in the process be transformative for our society. No democracy should ever allow pregnant women to be shackled during their pregnancy, during childbirth, or even in the weeks or months after they've given birth to a precious child. And this bill would prohibit it in all three of those phases. And that's why it's being supported by people on the left and people on the right. And while I acknowledge that there are concerns from some who want to make sure that we don't abandon the effort to pursue sentencing reform, I think all of us who have worked hard on this legislation, and I know my good friend Doug Collins feels this way, is that this is an effort that we will not walk away from. And the fact that we can make that commitment in a bipartisan way shows that notwithstanding all of the other chaos, crisis, and confusion on an issue such as this, that once divided America, as recently as 2.5 decades ago, we can begin to come together to reverse the damage done by the mass incarceration epidemic and put our society and incarcerated individuals in a better place. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigations, the Honorable Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas, for her opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. Let me acknowledge both Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Collins. I am of the old school, and that is the holistic of the hand is stronger than the individual fingers. We are strengthened when we shake hands with a firm shake of the hand, and not necessarily the grasp of a finger. Judiciary Committee is the backbone of our underlying premises of liberty and justice for all. So as I thank my colleagues, let me also acknowledge Mr. Nadler and Mr. Goodlatte, who over the last couple of months have been building on the idea of cooperation and collaboration and discussion. Interestingly enough, we were just on a CODAL that had members that were Republicans and Democrats. So I have no quarrel and misunderstanding that we have the opportunity for cooperation. Let me also acknowledge Mr. Sensenbrenner and my partner on the Subcommittee on Crime for his continued commitment to justice and the reformation of the criminal justice system. And let me thank all the other members of this committee, particularly those on the Crime Subcommittee, for the expertise and commitment that they bring to this discussion. I have, for the decades that I have been on this committee, joined with my colleagues and asked and joined and supported the idea of criminal justice reform that includes sentencing reform, to be able to ensure that the issue of mass incarceration is truly addressed. All of us agree that it is, in fact, a issue that has driven our family members, no matter what part of the nation you come from, into conditions that are extensively and extremely long. So from actions in 2010 to the agreement that we had in the last term under the presidency of Barack Obama, when we were prepared to go forward with a combination of prison reform, albeit the bill we have before us has certainly an enormous amount of important additions, of which I am grateful, we have always tied the two together. To be honest, to my constituents, to the nation, it's important to argue for that combination again. But I do want to say, as we approach this bill today, I give an open letter to the Director of the Bureau of Prisons that the legislation, if finally signed, must be taken seriously. Additional staff has to be included. The lifting of the cap that is on the Bureau of Prisons that gives them no extra funding for their actual staff, the utilizing of social workers in guard positions, there has to be that commitment that we make sure that we follow and have this working. We heard discussions about the importance of treating and acknowledging the increased incarceration of pregnant women. Grateful of the unshackling that will be an enhanced blessing for them, but also challenged by the fact that the Samaritan legislation that deals with the addressing of those who are pregnant and give birth while incarcerated, a bill that would serve billions of dollars, 63 to 70 billion annually, and an average cost of $32,000 per inmate, or as high as $50,000 to $60,000, that we hope we'll be able, as we move to the floor, address that question, address resources for dealing with women suffering from mental, alcohol, or sexual abuse, rather than throwing away hope for the millions of children that may be born while their mother is incarcerated. We have had many groups to support us on the idea of prison reform and, of course, the idea of sentencing reform. With that in mind, I call upon those groups to continue to work with us. As I close, Mr. Chairman, let me just say this final sentence. I am a product of the civil rights movement. It was all the groups and Hollywood stars that came forward to help us express the need for freedom for African Americans. I want to thank the civil rights groups, some of whom are in this room, for I would never deny that they're a vital part of justice. Their advocacy, their input should continue, their strength should continue, and if we do include all of those, Mr. Chairman, as we go forward to the floor, I can assure you this will be the mantle that we march on as we build on criminal justice reform and sentencing reform. With that, I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman, and to those who worked on this issue, they know that I will continue, as ranking member of the subcommittee, to work with them as well. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The bill is now open to amendment. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of the First Step Act. This is not about being soft on crime. This is actually about reducing crime. Mr. Chairman, it wasn't many years ago, particularly in the state of Florida, where you could have an inmate who might be the most incorrigible, disruptive inmate in a facility who is in administrative confinement, which means he's locked up by himself today, but tomorrow he is end of sentence. He is EOS. And tomorrow he will get out, they will put him on a bus, send him back to my community in Jacksonville, Florida. He would get off that bus with his blue bag, which identified him to all the prostitutes within a couple blocks and all of the drug dealers within a couple blocks. And that incorrigible inmate would hit the streets of Jacksonville getting off of a bus. And that was reentry not too many years ago. And we wonder why these individuals failed and went back to a life of crime. I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, this First Step Act recognizes the importance of following up an arrest with good correctional programming that attempts to change behavior before sending these individuals back to the community and sending them back in a regulated and intelligent way so that we have reentry planning so that before they ever get back to the community, you know where they're going to work, you know where they're going to live, you know where they're going to worship, You know their mental health issues, you know their physical issues. All of those things are addressed before these individuals are returned to the community. So, Mr. Chairman, I will tell you, failing to do these things, failing to have a therapeutic model community within your correctional facilities where you are planning for release, we're setting these individuals up for failure if we do not do that. And so I want to thank the chairman, Mr. Collins, and Mr. Jeffries for all their hard work on this, all the others, colleagues who have brought this to this point. This is truly about reducing crime in our communities. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is any member seeking recognition? Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment that should be at the desk.
All right. Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682, offered by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee.
Member we considered as read. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While I'm pleased that this bill seeks to expand eligibility for the release of aging prisoners, compassionate release program, this bill, in my opinion, doesn't go far enough, and this is a subject I've worked on for several Congresses. The amendment that I offer would make this program, which is in the bill a pilot program, a permanent one. I really don't think we need a pilot program for such a proposal because it's just common sense. If you make it permanent, it would ensure that prisoners who participate in the program are not sent back to prison if they are released to halfway houses for minor infractions while in home detention. My amendment would only return such individuals back to prison if they commit a felony or crime of violence while in home detention. We're talking about nonviolent, non-sex offending, non-terrorist offenders. Keeping eligible members of this population in prison makes no moral sense or no financial sense. I've had clients when I was an attorney, practicing attorney, who were sent back to prison after being in halfway houses for smoking a joint. That made no sense. The disproportionate punishment to the offense was not only a cost financially to our society, but it was immoral to put that individual back in prison for another 10 years for smoking a joint. According to the Department of Justice's Inspector General, elderly inmates are less likely to commit misconduct while incarcerated. They have a lower rate of rearrest once released and are more expensive to incarcerate than their younger counterparts. Bureau of Prison Institutions with the highest percentage of aging inmates spend 5 times more on inmates on medical care. So if we want to make a change, this seems like a good place to start. I commend the sponsors for putting in a pilot program, but I only commend them a little bit, small c, because you don't need a pilot program for something that's obvious and can be seen and understood based on the fact that crime goes down. People get older, they're not going to be as likely to commit crime. These are people that will be 60 years of age, have served 2/3 of their time. They ought to be released and not continue to burden us and not continue to keep them away from their families. So I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield to the lady from California.
For a question, I agree with this, but here's a question. It has to do with nonviolent inmates, which I understand. But there's a situation that has come into effect that I've worked on a lot when I was in local government in particular, where you have even violent inmates, but they're so compromised medically that they're just a cost to the system. They're in a coma. And because their offense is a bad one, they can't be released, even though it makes the taxpayers, it makes sense. I mean, the cost of treating somebody in a coma in prison is wildly more expensive than treating somebody in a coma, outside of a prison. Would that be covered by this amendment?
Well, is Mr. Collins still around? I don't think he is. Mr. Jeffries, you might be able to Mr. Jeffries, can you edify us on what your pilot program has in it as far as what Ms. Lofgren discussed as far as the violent person who may be in a very, very difficult
I mean, so
medical
compromised
situation?
that they cannot even act.
No, I agree with the intent of the Cohen Amendment in the context of accelerating compassionate release. And let me simply
Oh,
say,
I do too. I don't mean to say
Right.
otherwise.
and I think there's, research and evidence to make the argument that at a certain point in time, age incapacitates you as it relates to a propensity for violence. I would note in the context of the pilot program, however, that the original bill allowed for the establishment of a pilot program in one facility. This bill allows for a pilot program in every facility. And so in effect, while different facilities will still be, it won't have permanent status, this is a substantial step forward, but I think the distinguished gentlelady from California raises an important point that we need to consider as this bill advances.
Well, maybe we can work on this between now and the floor, but I remember when I was in local government, we ran the county jail, and we had an inmate who was accused of a terrible crime. I think it was child molesting, and he threw himself off the second floor and struck his head and was in a coma. And he never regained consciousness. We spent a fortune on this fellow because he was in custody. We couldn't get him released because of the nature of his offense, whereas he really belonged in a nursing home setting.
If I can reclaim my time,
Yes.
and it's about out, I agree with what you're saying. The proposal limits it to nonviolent crimes. That should be the permanent part.
I agree with that.
And what you're suggesting with people who might have committed crimes of violence, that maybe should be a pilot project. But this could be bifurcated, and the pilot project could consider people with that violent crimes of convictions and are in certain states of disability. But the people who are nonviolent criminals, there's just no reason to have a pilot program. That's why I offered the amendment to make it permanent, and I think it was considered, but anyway, I'd like for us to adopt it, and I yield back.
If the gentleman would yield for just 10 seconds more, I support the amendment, and I'd like to work with Mr. Collins and others to see if we could address. It's really a financial issue for the taxpayers. It has nothing to do with public safety, and perhaps we could deal with this between now and the floor. I thank the gentleman for your
Thank you, and I yield back the time
expired.
that I don't have.
For purposes, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And look, I think with Mr. Cohen's amendment, we have had a conversation. It's not something that, that I'm not opposed to, but on this program and his amendment and making this permanent, there's just not the justification in looking at that. And especially as the previous existed, this also gives us a chance now to expand the program, look at numbers, and have the draft in such a way that more prisoners will be able to participate. And because of this, as was just previously said, the numbers can be looked at, and Congress will have the necessary information to decide. But also in this amendment is something that is something that we're not going to really be able to reconcile, and I do not support, is Mr. Cohen's amendment would only permit someone convicted of a felony to be removed from home confinement and returned to a BOP facility. This is too high a standard that would pose a risk to public safety. Under this scenario, we would see an offender commit numerous misdemeanors such as assault, battery, or domestic violence and still not be ordered to return to a BOP facility. That's just simply unacceptable. Home confinement is under the pilot program is a privilege, and it isn't too much to ask for someone benefiting from it to obey certain rules, and I would encourage my colleagues to oppose the
Would the
amendment.
gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Take out the portion on only a felony. Put them back for whatever you want, but make the program permanent.
I'll be happy to work with the gentleman as we go further on this, and as the gentleman well knows, there's many things that we can work on with Mr. Jefferson and myself, but on this bill, I would oppose this amendment.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Issa? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Poe? Mr. Marino, Mr. Gowdy, Mr. Labrador, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes no. Ms. Handel? Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Schneider? Ms. Demmings? Ms. Demmings votes aye.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert.
Mr. Gomert votes no.
The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Handel.
Ms. Handel votes no.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino.
Mr. Marino votes no.
As the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Schneider votes yes.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members voted aye, 15 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682? For purposes, the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682 offered by Mr. Richmond. Page 32, beginning on line 21, strike prison reform and reject.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I hope that I won't need that much time. Current law reads right now that a prisoner who is serving a term of imprisonment of more than 1 year, other than a term of imprisonment for the duration of the prisoner's life, may receive credit toward service of the prisoner's sentence beyond the time served of up to 54 days at the end of each year. That's current law. So the amendment in the bill, they clear up that it is 54 days, which is current law. So the amendment just makes sure that BOP, as they calculate prisoners' good time, that they ensure that they give them the 54 days per year for all the years that they have served. So it really just clarifies it and makes sure that they apply it to sentences that are already, people that are already serving their sentences. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would just ask favorable adoption of the amendment.
Chair thanks gentleman, recognizes himself. This amendment clarifies that the language in the bill that deals with credit towards service of sentence for satisfactory behavior, commonly referred to as good time credit. It indicates that our amendment to that statute applies to all current prisoners. While I feel that the current language is sufficient to cover all current prisoners, I understand that some members have genuine concerns that it needs to be stated explicitly. Respecting those concerns, I'm happy to accept this amendment and urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Chair is happy to yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Yeah, just move strike last word.
Gentleman
Are
needs
you,
to-
Jim, yield? Gentlemen, Chairman, thank you. Again, this is a clarification amendment. I support it. I'm on with Mr. Richmond, Ms. Jackson Lee, Ms. Jeffries, and Ms. Demmings as well. This is simply a clarification and is needed, and I do appreciate the chairman accepting.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. For the purpose, the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition.
Strike the last word and to join, and
Woman is
again,
recognized.
I made the point of the opportunity for bipartisanship, and so I'm delighted to join Mr. Richmond, Collins, Jeffries, and Demmons as a co-sponsor of this, and to indicate that clarification sometimes can be a lifeline, and I think the idea of retroactivity is a lifeline and an important statement going forward. So I'd ask my colleagues to support this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back enthusiastically both for the amendment and yielding back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman enthusiastically. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682? For purpose, the gentleman from Florida seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682 offered by Mr. Gates of Florida. Page 71, beginning on line 9, strike for 2 years in at least 10 facilities and insert for 5 years in at least 20
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the sponsors of the underlying legislation, Mr. Collins and Mr. Jeffries, for advancing the cause of programs that match inmates with unwanted animals. I've seen circumstances where Dogs Behind Bars programs have inured to the benefit not only of inmates, but of our favorite four-legged friends. They create lasting bonds and have shown to reduce recidivism and also to make animals more adoptable and less likely to be euthanized. In my correspondence and interaction with the Bureau of Prisons, it seems to indicate that there's a broader capacity to be able to implement pilot programs that are stated in the bill, and so we would be slightly more ambitious than the underlying legislation and move from a 2-year 10-facility model to a 5-year 20-facility model. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
If the gentleman would yield.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Actually, if you would yield to me.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
I would tell the gentleman that I think his amendment is a good one. We appreciate him working with us on both sides of the aisle, and I'm prepared to accept the amendment. Gentleman from Georgia may be prepared to.
Gentleman yield.
Certainly.
Again, I appreciate the gentleman's willingness to work with us. He did come through, and I do also accept this amendment.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682? For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682 offered by Mr. Gomert of Texas. Page 45, insert after line 23 the following. Section 106, faith-based considerations.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Texas recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this bill does, in some parts, discuss faith-based groups as being eligible for certain things, and I'm really pleased with that because as we've had since in my 13 and a half years here, discussions, whether it was the Second Chance Act, a lot of different studies and bills and things we've looked at, we continue to find what judges and those analyzing the Texas system found, and that is when it is a faith-based group that is involved in trying to help both prisoners who are incarcerated and those that are coming out and adjusting to life. Faith-based groups have extraordinary cuts to recidivism, and sometimes we have found discrimination against faith-based groups because somebody says something in reviewing different proposals for whether it's counseling or helping people adjust, or mentoring. Well, gee, it's faith-based, so we may be violating the Constitution by giving them the opportunity to work with people and helping them adjust. And that is so entirely misplaced. I mean, it's about 180 degrees from where the Constitution was. This was supposed to be a country where you did not discriminate against anyone or any group because of its basis in a faith, particularly faith in God, and the kind of love and mentoring that accompanies groups like that. So I'm pleased with what I saw about mentioning of faith-based groups in a non-discriminatory way, but I would like this amendment to be part of the bill so that it makes clear to everybody you don't award or accept or utilize a group because it is not faith-based, that you, under our Constitution, can consider those types of groups as well so that we don't have any misunderstanding. It should not be at all offensive to anyone. It just says don't discriminate against groups, even if they are faith-based. So it's very short, as you can see, just 6 lines that would be added, but that should eliminate any question about whether a group should be discriminated against. And I appreciate the work that's all been done, but I think this will help put it over the top.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes. Yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I've had the opportunity just in the last couple of years as we've been working on this to visit a number of federal prisons. Thanks to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, visited 3 federal prisons in his state. Thanks to the gentleman from Georgia, I visited the Atlanta Penitentiary, and everywhere I go, I hear very favorable comments from the employees and the wardens in these prisons about the great work done by faith-based organizations of all kinds and all denominations. So I think you're protected already, because I think this is widely viewed as a good source of talent for helping people as they get ready to leave prison. But I also think all it says is no discrimination.
Just don't discriminate.
Against those groups, and I'm happy to accept the amendment.
Yep. Would the gentleman from Texas yield?
Yes.
Again, I think this is one of, I have to go back, and this is one of the things that I know that we, Representative Jeffries and I have talked about. Faith-based community and others have been very instrumental in making this bill happen. They've been very much supportive of this, and yours just confirms that and would be accepted, just as the chairman would have said. And I appreciate that you bringing it and would accept it.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield briefly?
Who's asked?
Here.
Oh, yes. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Gowen. Mr. Chairman, I just want to associate myself with all these comments and say, as a former religious liberty defense attorney who worked in the courts defending faith-based organizations, it is widely acknowledged, but it's not always widely understood. And I think even if we're restating what is already protected in law, there is simply no harm in it, and actually great value could come from it. With a nod to the late, great Chuck Colson, Prison Fellowship Ministries, and all the others who follow in their wake, they have done a tremendous job. And I think this is a great amendment, and I'm glad to support it.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I realize my time expired, but just as you've indicated, I have been in a federal prison where they said in a 12-step program that a faith-based group was utilizing, they could not even refer to a higher being. They had to change that up because it might be discriminatory. They didn't understand. So I think this just clarifies it, and appreciate the chairman's indulgence.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682?
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682, offered by Mr. Swalwell of California. Page 40, line 25, strike "and" at the end. Page 41, line 5.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and members from both sides for working on this important issue. I do intend to support the bill. I do want to make just one improvement to the bill around an issue that I have come to learn about regarding electronic monitoring, and it actually just relates to transparency and reporting. As a former prosecutor, I saw the benefits of electronic monitoring to reduce incarceration, but I also have seen that if electronic monitoring fails, it can be deadly to a victim, but also it can be used as an example and projected upon deserving people and prevent them from having electronic monitoring. If one example is used to define a whole community of worthy defendants worthy of not being incarcerated. And so my amendment, Mr. Chairman, would first address this issue, and under the amendment, officers supervising offenders with electronic monitors would have to review daily the data that they generate. Second, any alerts generated would require an actual investigation into what the prisoner did to cause the alert. Third, officers wouldn't be permitted to be responsible for so many offenders that it would be infeasible for them to respond to alerts. This is something we have learned is a chronic problem across the country. And finally, officers would report errors or problems with machines to a centralized database, including problems which interfere with the ability of offenders to go where they are authorized to go or to do what they are authorized to do. That way we could spot systemic malfunctions and improve device performance more quickly. And this is, to highlight one case of what can go wrong is the 2013 case of David Renz. Awaiting trial for child pornography, he was monitored electronically. There were too many false alarms being generated, so the manufacturer of the device suggested disabling alerts being transmitted unless the tampering lasted longer than 5 minutes. Dozens of alerts were thus not transmitted. Mr. Renz was able to use the 5 minutes to take off and put together his monitor so he could move around undetected. He used that time to murder a librarian and raped a 10-year-old girl. There's also the problem of overwhelmed probation officers. For example, the Los Angeles Times reported in 2014 that Los Angeles County probation officers are inundated with alerts and at times receive as many as 1,000 a day. So this would increase transparency, understanding, and also make sure that our officers are not overwhelmed by the number of prisoners who are being monitored. It's a straightforward amendment to make sure that as we rely on technology as a part of our effort to improve the transition of prisoners to society and reduce recidivism, we do so in a way that's safe for the community, helpful for offenders, and workable for probation officers. I believe no matter where you are on the underlying bill, that this should be enacted and that we want it to be implemented in the best possible way. So I urge all members to support my amendment, and if there are any questions, I'd also be happy to yield time. I yield back.
The chair recognizes himself in response to the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. This amendment is intended to require the Director of the Bureau of Prisons to ensure an officer of the Bureau of Prisons or United States Probation and Pretrial Services supervises each prisoner assigned an electronic monitoring device as a condition of pre-release custody. This amendment appears to be a solution in search of a problem. Essentially, the amendment requires the Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. probation employees to do their jobs. If there is a problem with how the BOP and U.S. probation currently operate the electronic monitoring system, it can certainly be worked out between the Bureau of Prisons and Probation and Pretrial Services. There is no need for Congress to dictate exactly how the employees are to do their jobs down to the minute details. Additionally, I have constitutional concerns with the amendment. The amendment directs the Bureau of Prisons Director, who is an executive branch official, to ensure that an officer of the United States Probation and Pretrial Services, who is a judicial branch official, performs his job in a certain way. There may be separation of powers issues with this amendment.
Would the chairman yield?
In just a second. Even assuming, however, that there are no constitutional issues, this amendment nevertheless manages to be both unnecessary and overly prescriptive. Having said that, and I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman, having said that, I am interested in the nature of the problem that the gentleman described in the particular case that he described. And if the gentleman would withdraw the amendment, I'd be happy to work with him on whether there were any tweaks to the bill that could be done to address some of his concerns. But as it stands right now, and I'll listen again, but as it stands right now, I would not be inclined to support the amendment.
I appreciate the chair's concerns, and this is something that we've been researching with and trying to work with the administrator of courts. And as you pointed out, there is a separation of powers issue, but I see that issue as the limited oversight ability we have on individuals who are under electronic monitoring. It's been very difficult for me to get data from the courts, and in fact, data that has been sent to me, they have marked as law enforcement sensitive, and so I'm limited in how I can even talk publicly about a lot of the concerns that I've seen with electronic monitoring and the false alerts. But I am happy to withdraw this and work with the chair, and perhaps in the report language, we can address these concerns.
I'd be happy to do that. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the bill? For purpose of the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk or on its way to the desk.
We will watch its progress.
Mr. Chairman, just to save a little time, similar to Mr. Gomert's.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's similar to Mr. Gomert's amendment where he actually added a section 106 about not discriminating because it's a faith-based organization. This amendment simply goes up that page to where we talk about savings and the money appropriated, that programs that were established under the Second Chance Act would qualify. And it doesn't mandate that it go there, but it specifically says those programs authorized by the Second Chance Act. And I think it's at the desk. So it just adds a...
Well, if the gentleman would suspend, we'll have the clerk report the amendment, and we'll return to the gentleman. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682, offered by Mr. Richmond of Louisiana. Page 45, line 11.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman may resume his...
So, Mr. Chairman, if you go to page 45, any of the savings associated with the bill can go into evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, ensuring eligible prisoners have access to such programs and productive activities, and then now 3, investment in the programs authorized under the Second Chance Act of 2007.
The gentleman yield.
Yes.
I like the gentleman's motive. I'm a little concerned that we may be sending this bill to another committee's jurisdiction because it affects the appropriations authority in doing so. If the gentleman would work with us and maybe withdraw the amendment, we'll be happy to see if we can come up with a way to accomplish the goal without giving another committee a claim at this bill after it leaves here. Which
Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682? We ready to go? Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the... I'm sorry.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5682, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas. Page 54, after the matter following line 4, insert the following. Section...
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
I thank the gentleman. Let me get the attention of Mr. Collins, know that he's engaged. Mr. Collins, because I do want to acknowledge that we've had good, vigorous discussions regarding the Samara bill that I have held for a very long time. What does that mean? And as well, Mr. Jeffries. And that is a bill that deals with the increasing number of women because of mass incarceration, who are incarcerated and come into the prison when they are pregnant. And it is an amendment that is near and dear to my heart because it is only a pilot program, and it is one that I believe with the commitment of the warden, working the language, it can actually work. And so it's a pilot program for young children to reside with their incarcerated mothers upwards of 36 months. We have data that shows that infant mortality increases when a mother who is incarcerated gives birth, and that child can no longer remain with that mother in terms of bonding and what we call, and obviously nursing. And I know that several groups, including a group that I look forward to working with, who's worked very hard, Cut 50, has worked on issues dealing with women, incarcerated women, as well as our colleague, Congresswoman Bass, who's worked on the shackling issue. So this amendment would, in fact, take into consideration to accept the responsibility of the parents rearing the children in prison, participate in any educational counseling requirements of the pilot program, including child development, parenting skills, domestic violence, vocational training, or substance abuse, abide by any court decisions regarding the legal or physical custody of the child, transfer to the Bureau of Prisons any child support payments from any person or government entity so they would be useful for the federal prison, and specify a person who has agreed to take custody of the child, the prisoner's participation in the pilot program terminated before the prison's release. It has all of the firewalls that are necessary to address this question. And I'd ask my colleagues to really take a moment and use whatever search engine you have to find out the high statistics of women who are incarcerated, and as well the growing numbers of women who are pregnant as they are incarcerated, and the factor of breaking the cycle of those who are born of incarcerated parents from the cycle of themselves of being a product of the criminal justice system on the wrong end. I'd ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I look forward to working going forward on a vital component in the new arena, new atmosphere, and might I say, to all of the evangelical groups that we have, I think it is important to recognize that as you support the unification of family, family values, this is family values. This is family values. With that, I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to submit into the record the letter dated May 8th from a number coming from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Without objection, the letter will be made a part of the record for.
I yield back. Thank you.
For purposes, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, I got tied up. And to the gentlelady from Texas, we have worked on
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have worked together on many things. On this one, though, there are several issues, and we have worked and done well, and I appreciate so much the gentlelady's participation, especially in the shackling issues and some other issues that have been coming in dealing with this. But with this amendment, there are some, although clear, heartfelt desire and need to look at this, there are some things that do cause me concern that I would either ask the gentlelady to withdraw or I will, oppose on, is really there's no limitation on length of sentence, there's no limitation on the type of crime, and one of the unintended, consequences is that the mother could be in for, a very long time, and then at a certain point in time, there is the 3-year-old who would be separated from their parent, from their mother. This is as someone as a pastor, as a chaplain, and we talk about nuclear families, this is a discussion. It's hard enough to have the child while incarcerated, but then at a certain point in time have the other unintended consequences of all of a sudden at 3 years old being separated from the mother and then having to live a life of separation at that point and making other arrangements. We have asked for the number of pregnant inmates in BOP. I have not seen that number. I know our staffs have. So at this point in time, look, I just appreciate the gentlelady's heart in this, the outstanding work. There's no greater advocate in this area than Ms. Jackson-Lee. But I would ask that at this point, especially in regards to this bill, moving forward with the good stuff that has already been put, that we either continue to work together as we have to find certain solutions to withdraw now, or in not a lot of that, which I would understand, I would have to oppose this amendment for the numerous questions that this brings up in light of that. And with that, I yield.
Will the
back.
gentleman yield?
I will.
Let me say that the gentleman has a passion for families, and obviously in the pilot program, the child, through normal visitation of family members and potentially the custodial person that would come into play for the child past 3 years old, would have interface with those individuals. And so I do understand the breach, if you will, that the child goes to live with grandma, but think of the strength of that child that has had the exposure to that parent. Now, let me just say that I have a passion for this issue because the numbers of incarcerated women you will find are hugely growing, and that means that the numbers of pregnant women will grow as well. I would look forward to working with both co-sponsors, and I would welcome the idea of a vote in which that we cast just a vote, and whatever comes of it, we will accept. I will not ask for a roll call vote, but I believe it's important that we recognize that women are important, unfortunately, elements of reform for a 21st century prison system, and would greatly want them to know that their unique condition of pregnancy is of vital importance, and the idea of family is of vital importance. So some of the issues that you raised, let us look forward to setting a framework, and I thank you for your input. I ask my colleagues to support the Samara amendment. Jackson Lee.
And reclaiming my time, I think I appreciate the gentlelady's concern, but given the fact of moving forward with this amendment, due to the many concerns that I have raised previously, I will ask for a no vote on this amendment, and do look forward to working with the gentlelady as we move forward. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Beneath the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 5682? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 5682 as amended favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford votes yes. Ms. Handel? Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss votes aye. Mr. Nadler?
Mr. Chairman, though it is a much improved bill, and I hope it improves further before it gets to the floor so I can vote yes at that point. At this point, I have no choice but to vote no.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
I look forward to working on some of the issues of passion and compassion as we move forward to the floor, appreciating those who have co-sponsored it. I vote no.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
Not wanting the perfect to be the enemy of the good, I vote yes.
Mr. Cohen votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond?
Aye.
Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries?
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Aye. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Aye. Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Because I want the first step to be the best step that we can take, I'm voting no at this point.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider votes aye. Ms. Demmings? Ms. Demmings votes aye.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino.
Mr. Marino votes yes.
Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Mr. King votes no.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert.
Mr. Gomert votes yes.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Jordan votes yes.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Poe votes yes.
Who was that?
Well, that's why I told him. I said, you can make whatever point you want to make.
I think we have a story to tell. I think, Mr. Chairman, that we should meet with Goodland.
Do not try to score points on our
Meet with him. You know, we shouldn't deny ourselves the opportunity before it goes. No.
You done? Joe, you done? Did he get it? Oh, it's still counting votes. Yeah, but my thing is, you're not about to try to score. Yeah. Who are they waiting on?
Yeah, better be close, so. And Biggs, too. Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Mr. Chairman,
For purpose of the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
how am I recorded, Mr. Chairman?
The clerk will advise the gentleman from Georgia how he voted on his bill.
Short-term memory loss.
Yes.
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 Gentleman is recorded as a yes. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 25 members voted aye, 5 members voted no.
Ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views.